Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Kareem, good evening, good afternoon to some of you. And Mohammed Al Sudairi, who's in Hong Kong, I think it's already good night to you.
Yes.
Welcome to this webinar on repercussions of COVID-19 on Gulf-Asia relations, which is hosted by the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh, in cooperation with the Emirates Diplomatic Academy, Abu Dhabi. Thank you for joining us from different parts of the world. On a positive note, thanks to COVID-19, we are able to add value to webinars like this with more people joining us than otherwise. I'm Dr. N. Janardhan, Senior Research Fellow, Gulf Asia Program at the Emirates Diplomatic Academy, and I will be your moderator for the next 90 minutes. The King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies has been a platform for scholars specializing on Gulf issues. The Asia unit has accomplished a fair bit in encouraging Gulf scholars working on Asia, particularly China. It hosted a meeting of sinologists in the Gulf in 2019 and repeated this exercise in Kuwait earlier this year. It hopes to expand this to include more Asian countries in the future. For the Emirates Diplomatic Academy, which trains diplomats and doubles up as a think tank, the Gulf Asia program is equally important. Apart from broadening the scope of research on Gulf Asia relations, it is also attempting to promote young regional talent on this subject in what I call Khaliji voices. And today's presentation and discussion will be led by three young stars from the region. I'll introduce them in a bit. Before that, why did we choose this topic for discussion? Long before the United States announced its strategic rebalancing policy of pivot to Asia, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries had set their eyes and recognized Asia as an ally of the future. Though these ties were rooted primarily in transactional economic activities, they have evolved into agents capable of impacting geopolitics. The increasing significance of Asia as an ally of the GCC countries occurred at a time when first, Asia's oil consumption was soaring amid an economic boom, and second, the economies of the GCC countries were robust following high oil prices and needed new avenues to diversify and invest. A series of geopolitical events thereafter converted the buyer-seller relationship into a strategic one. We are at a new juncture now. COVID-19 has turned the world upside down, or so it appears over the last 3 months. There are all sorts of speculation about disruptions in the economic, political, and security spheres. And there are more questions than answers. So our focus this evening will be on 3 questions. Since we are dealing with Asia, how can we evaluate the responses of various Asian countries to COVID-19 pandemic? How have Gulf-Asia relations been impacted by this crisis? And how will Gulf-Asia ties pan out in a post-COVID-19 world? To answer these questions, we have on our panel 3 scholars, each of them an expert on different part of Asia. Dr. Mohammed Al Sudairi, Mr. Hassan Al Hassan, and Dr. Sharifa Al Adwani. Before we get started, some house rules. Mohammed, Hassan, and Sharifa will each speak for about 15 minutes. I will alert the speakers 2 minutes before their allotted time is over so they can wrap up. And that should leave us with about 40 minutes for Q&A. Let's begin with Dr. Mohammed Al Sudairi. Dr. Mohammed Al Sudairi is a non-resident senior researcher and head of the Asian Studies Unit. He has a PhD in comparative politics from the University of Hong Kong, a double degree, that's a master's from Peking University and the London School of Economics and International Relations and International History. He is fluent in Arabic, English, and Mandarin. His research interests encompass Sino-Middle Eastern relations, Islamic and leftist connections between East Asia and the Arab world, and Chinese politics. And Mohammed was really instrumental in helping this discussion come together. Thank you, Mohammed, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janardhan, for those kind words. And you were equally instrumental in bringing about this event. I'm very happy that we could convene this webinar, and I hope this will be the start of many collaborations between our two institutions and others in the Gulf to forward research on Asia writ large. So I'll try to answer the three questions that lie at the core of this webinar in a systematic fashion. So with regards to the first one, how can we evaluate the Chinese state's response to COVID-19? I'd like to preface my comment by first saying that I'm not going to evaluate it from a public health perspective. I think there are professionals and experts who can evaluate the effectiveness of those measures or lack thereof more so than I. What I'll be rather interested in is evaluating them from a political perspective. And I think the relevance of that sort of political analysis is really when we look at the contemporary discussions on China's management of the crisis. There are really two dominating narratives at this point. One narrative is essentially that of the cover-up, that essentially China's authorities have tampered with the data, that they have silenced whistleblowers in the early phases of the crisis, that a lot of the measures that had been imposed by the Chinese authorities have been very ham-fisted, and that overall, the Chinese approach is not what it seems to be. The other narrative, which is sort of an inverse mirror image, is what we could call the decisive narrative. That is to say that the state has utilized very effective measures. It has mobilized state and societal resources to contain this disease, and that it's actually, in the long run, a more humane approach. And oftentimes, these two narratives are always juxtaposed with the developments happening in the West. Initially Italy, but now the United States. And oftentimes, the figures are at the center of these comparisons, right? China's revised figures of 4,000 dead in comparison to the United States, 80,000. And I think personally, the reality of how we can evaluate China's reaction to COVID-19 is somewhere probably in between. And I'll mention three sort of comments or points with regards to that. First of all, I think when people think about these measures and these approaches adopted by the Chinese authorities, we really need to humanize the Chinese political system. And what I mean by humanize is not necessarily to empathize or sympathize with it, but to remember that we're dealing with a very complex bureaucratic Leninist system populated by human beings in different horizontal and vertical positions within this system who have their own different agendas, competition over resources, and whose behavior is also defined or shaped by different regimes of incentives and punishments. So this notion that we're dealing with a centralized state is something that needs to be challenged and is often forgotten. And actually, this notion of a centralized state lies at the heart of these various different narratives. So for instance, what do I mean by that? The relationship between the central government and local provincial governments is often very complicated. Provincial governments and local officials oftentimes don't communicate fully the information on the ground due to political reasons or fears of losing the ability to advance in their careers. So, for example, one of the things that's discussed early on in the crisis is how there was a delay in imposing measures in Wuhan, as well as Hubei province, generally speaking, because provincial level meetings, the two meetings for the Provincial People's Congress, as well as the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, were all being held in early January. So officials were very hesitant to cancel these very important political events, which would jeopardize their advancement moving forward. Another aspect of the complexity of the system is how the central government's directives are often either ignored or applied haphazardly by different provinces. There's also considerable competition across provinces because of differences in their economic capacity or their different agendas at the level of provincial government. So we see this, for example, in how when the travel restrictions were lifted in the case of Hubei province and many people were moving outside of the province, there was actually a face-off between the police authorities of Hubei province and Jiangxi province. The reason being is that Jiangxi still wanted to impose travel restrictions and did not want the perceived transmission of the disease from Hubei to elsewhere. Or even early on in the crisis, a lot of provinces were stealing one another's medical aid. So aid that was earmarked for one province would be taken by the province in which this aid was passing through. So this shows, I think, the complexity and difficulty of China. So this notion that there is a conveyment of data and information is possible, but it's also something that could be explained by the bureaucratic complexity of the system writ large. The other 2 points that I want to mention in response to this question is we should not neglect the role of society in the overall evaluation of this assessment, in the sense that sometimes the state there's a time lag in which the state responds effectively to a crisis, and oftentimes society fills these gaps. So we see this in the case of the mainland and even in Hong Kong in a few months before, where citizens automatically began to wear masks and began to pursue social distancing measures without any directives from the state. And this has a lot to do with the fact that there's collective memory of, for example, SARS, which was also a very deadly epidemic that had spread in those areas and is still embedded in terms of people's memories from then on. The last point that I want to mention is, I think what tends to be forgotten in the discussions about how to evaluate China's response to COVID-19 is that we tend to focus primarily on the public health reactions. And I think what we should pay attention to also is how, looking forward, the Chinese authorities are going to respond economically to the crisis, because the crisis has obviously imposed significant damage on the Chinese economy as well as global economies. I mean, one piece of data, for instance, that I had obtained from Macro Polo, which is a very excellent source for information on the Chinese economy, is that the number of unemployed is somewhere within the realm of 30 million people, most of whom are coming from the service sector and construction and other places. And this has the potential to fuel social unrest. A lot of the private sector companies are also being shackled by considerable debts because of the lack of economic movement. So what we can see is that the state is actually quite concerned with this. So for instance, General Secretary Xi, or President Xi, last month when he was visiting Shanxi, one of his new slogans was the Liubao, which is the 6 insurances or 6 guarantees. So I wrote them down very quickly, sort of ensuring employment, basic livelihood, market entities, food and energy security, ensuring the continuation of the supply chain, and also guaranteeing the continued operation of grassroots institutions. The key here is, of course, employment and the maintaining of basic livelihoods, which is a considerable concern by the state. So I think for people who are interested in seeing how China is going to respond to the economic damage is to wait until the 21st or 22nd of May, when the 2 meetings will be held, the National People's Congress particularly, because the proceedings of that meeting will tell us, for example, what is going to be the GDP target rate that the Chinese authorities are going to decide. And also, secondly, whether they are going to actually release a stimulus plan. And of course, I personally lean towards believing that they probably will not release a stimulus as big as the one from 2009, because the Chinese economy is in a very different state. There's less liquidity. But I think these are things we have to keep an eye on looking forward in terms of how China is going to respond to COVID-19 writ large, which has considerable implications for not only China, but the global economy as a whole. I think now turning to the second and third questions, which are a bit shorter. The second question is, how have Gulf-China relations been impacted by COVID-19? Unfortunately, we don't really have data or concrete data available. I tried to check today and yesterday. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce, for example, which used to issue updated monthly data has stopped from January. Similarly, in terms of the IMF and Gulf equivalents, there hasn't been much data issued about the trade balance and the changes that have happened. I think probably this is suggestive of how serious the economic damage has been and how people are still in a process of really taking stock of the situation. But I would say that there are three different dimensions that we need to take into consideration with regards to thinking about how China-GCC relations have been impacted. And these are all economic comments, really. My sense is that the GCC-China relations have reached something of an inflection point. I know predictions are quite dangerous to make, but my assessment is that the golden era is already past. And what we're looking forward towards is really structural change in the economic relationship that will mean that the overall trade balance and economic dynamism between them will be much more reduced. And there are three dimensions to this. One, China's import of energy has decreased. And this has a lot to do with simply the deceleration of growth within the Chinese economy and the global economy. This might rebound down the line. I mean, there's still a debate among analysts between one party, for example, that says we've already reached peak oil in 2019 and others who place it far in the future. And also people for another party which believes that behaviors have been fundamentally, or consumptionary behaviors have been fundamentally changed. And therefore we're going to see a permanent reduction in the consumption of energy. I don't necessarily agree with that opinion, primarily because if we look at data in China, actually, there has been a complete rebound in terms of the consumption of energy in relation to vehicles. So actually vehicle use is back to its pre-COVID-19 levels. But I think generally speaking, there's going to be a reduced consumption of energy writ large from the Chinese economy as well as the global economy, at least for the coming period. Energy might very well rebound, but it's the other two dimensions that I am more concerned with. The second dimension is that I think COVID-19 has really brought to bear a lot of the problems in the political economies of the Gulf. And we can see that in terms of the statements of Gulf officials, such as the UAE Foreign Minister Qarqash or the Saudi Finance Minister Al-Jad'an, both of whom have essentially said that we are not going to be able to go back to the pre-COVID-19 status quo, and that there's going to be a fundamental restructuring of the Gulf economies. And this restructuring will essentially mean that the consumptionary capacities of the Gulf economies is going to be reduced. So that component of the trade balances between, say, the GCC and China economies were made up of, for example, cheaper products, consumptionary goods, will probably be reduced looking towards the future. And of course, the third dimension is something that is really contingent on various different variables and is open to interpretation. Is, for example, we're going to see reduced Chinese liquidity towards the region, whether in terms of investments or in terms of financial assistance, probably because this liquidity will be redirected within China itself to address its own mounting issues with debt and economic restructuring. So countries like Oman, for instance, which have had a recurrent turn towards Chinese loans from Chinese financial institutions like back in 2017, will probably not see China as an available outlet for funding. We can also expect damage hit on particular sectors that were looking forward to Chinese involvement. For example, the tourism industries. I mean, the UAE, at least for the past few years, on average, had over 1 million Chinese tourists. Saudi, from last year, when it had unveiled its new visa regime, the largest number of foreign nationals coming into the kingdom were largely Chinese. So these things are going to be halted, and they might rebound within a year or two once things start up. Although the picture is quite hazy because it's also reliant on the revival of the different airlines and air systems, some of which are going under or in the process of going under and being reduced. The last question, and I think I have 2 more minutes left, so I'll try to conclude with it since it's more of a future outward-looking question, is how will Gulf-China ties pan out in the post-COVID-19 world? I mean, I've already remarked a bit on sort of what I see as the trajectory of GCC China economy. I think it'll fundamentally still remain within the same formula, but I think we're going to see a contraction in the overall size. But I think the more important trend that I'm quite interested in, and I think should be on everyone's radar, is that post-COVID-19, there is one trend that will continue indefinitely, which is the continued deterioration in China's relationship with the United States and Western countries writ large. This trend has been happening or has been in the process of unfolding at least since 2012 and 2013. And in fact, one could argue that COVID-19 has intensified the contradictions and tensions between these different states. And we see that in terms of from last year and the year before, the politicization of technological relations, economic relations between the two sides, Huawei, technology standards, Chinese investments in infrastructure. And the Gulf is not going to be immune from the byproducts of these tensions. What we're seeing is, for example, growing pressures on the part of American officials, but also Western officials writ large, to politicize and criticize these different types of engagements. And if processes of decoupling, and of course decoupling is never going to be a straightforward process, but there is a growing political will to see decoupling and see the emergence of separate technological standards, this will have strategic and security implications for the Gulf, looking forward 5, 10 years down the line. And this is something that needs to be in our mind in terms of how do we preserve, for example, our collective national interests, and how do we maximize our benefits in a world where these tensions are growing across the board. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you. I'm looking forward to the comments.
Thank you, Mohammed. I was actually going to straight away question you on your assumption that things are not going to look too bright in terms of Gulf-Asia relations in the future, but I think you tempered that by suggesting that the volumes may reduce, but the trends will continue. I think that's what it would be. See, much also depends on how the Western economies do in the years ahead. If they are able to reinvent themselves, bring about some sort of innovation, and maybe this is that sort of time when they can pull their socks up and change the dynamics, then perhaps Gulf-Asia relations will not remain the same. But if they were to go along the same trend, then Gulf-Asia relations still continue to look bright. That's good. And I think you answered all those three questions. You addressed all those three questions. I think it was essentially very, very important for you to make that distinction in terms of what was happening inside China and how the rest of the world views China, the energy consumption patterns, because of course we are definitely going to see a major shift in terms of the consumption of crude fossil fuel, and the shift, all that is going to definitely impact Gulf-Asia relations. Thank you for that. And just before we move on to the next segment, I'm going to try attempting sharing my screen and showing a couple of pictures. They always say a picture. Oh, can I just request the IT team at the King Faisal Center to allow me to share the screen if they can. If you can't, I'll just proceed. Okay, looks like it's locked for now, but if we do get a chance, oh, okay, it seems they have allowed me to share my screen, and I'll do that. They often say that a picture tells 1,000 words, and I think here are a couple of slides that I wanted to show you in terms of what cartoonists are visualizing when they think of COVID-19. And that's very, very specific to China, the fight against COVID-19 in China. And just to add to what Mohammed just told us, here's something that we put together, adapted from Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation. This is the Chinese investments and contracts in the Gulf region from 2005 and 2019. I suppose if we were to have another discussion on this topic next year, we can try and see what has changed really. Okay, let's move on to the next segment, which is Mr. Hassan Al-Hassan, and he is an associate fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the Middle East especially, and he's a PhD candidate at King's College London. Hassan pursues research on contemporary Indian foreign policy in the Gulf. He served as a senior analyst on foreign policy and national security at the office of the first Deputy Prime Minister of Bahrain. Hassan is also a regular participant in Track 2 dialogues on Gulf regional security and a commentator on Middle Eastern affairs and international politics and political economy of the Gulf. He's a graduate of Sciences Po Paris and the London School of Economics. I had the chance of meeting Hassan Al-Hassan about a year ago, and we have had several conversations together, and I've thoroughly enjoyed interacting with him. Over to you, Hassan.
Thank you very much, Narinapa. The pleasure has been mine, and obviously you're a trailblazer in the field of the area of Gulf-India relations, which I'm going to touch on. So it's been wonderful interacting with you. Thank you very much once again to the King Faisal Center and to the Emirates Diplomatic Academy. I think it's fair to say that India occupies quite a unique position amongst the Asian powers when it comes to the Gulf and to the response as far as COVID-19 is concerned. Because of the presence of a very large diaspora, these repercussions from COVID-19 cut very, very close to home. So India, in a sense, when it comes even to the domestic responses of the Gulf states, it's always the figurative elephant in the room. I think, unlike my brilliant colleague, Dr. Mohammed, I'm not going to go about sequentially answering the three questions, but I will implicitly answer them throughout the presentation. I think my argument as far as the effects or repercussions of COVID-19 on Gulf-India relations, my argument is as follows up front. I think in the short term, it's going to be generating economic and political challenges. And I think these economic and political challenges are going to constrain the ability of leaders in the Gulf and in India from making a lot of progress in the very short term and in the near future. I think the long-term trajectory, though, is a bit different. Once we're sort of out of the crisis, once we're out of the bottleneck, generally, the Gulf-India relations are not very electorally or politically salient. They tend to be shielded from domestic political pressures. And I think there, what will matter for the future trajectory of Gulf-India relations are the perceptions of governing and policy-making elites in the Gulf and in India as to the usefulness and strategic importance of these relations going forward. And I think that I'll say this up front, the factors that are going to be most important as far as these elites are concerned in the post-COVID world are not going to be the same exact ones that were important in the pre-COVID world. So that's also important to take note of, but I'll explain as I go along. Now, before we dive into it, however, I did want to provide some background as to the trajectory of India-Gulf relations so far over the past 2 decades. India and the Gulf monarchies have enjoyed a steady growth in relations after almost more than half a century of mutual neglect during the Cold War. I think it's fair to say that after 9/11, the Gulf states began to recognize India as an emerging power and began to understand the economic and perhaps even strategic implications of India's rise, so to speak. And I think India has also reciprocated the interest. It has inaugurated a low-quest policy, has often spoken about the need to do more in its extended neighborhood, so to speak, which is often thought to include the Gulf. We've seen tremendous successes as a result. On the one hand, India has signed strategic partnership agreements with Saudi Arabia, with Oman, and with the UAE. And I think overall, India has succeeded in getting rid of the issues, Pakistan, Kashmir, treatment of Indian Muslims, that had plagued Gulf-India relations for a very long time. These things have disappeared off the foreign policy agenda. And I think that's a major diplomatic victory for India over the past 2 decades. Economically, I think it's fair to focus on 3 key metrics to look at the volume of the relationship. So the Indian diaspora obviously is a very important one. The waves of migration began in earnest following the oil boom of the 1970s. According to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, we have up to 8.5 million Indians who reside in the Gulf at the moment. And they send back somewhere to the tune of $50 billion in annual remittances. That's about 60% of India's total inward remittances from the entire world. So it's a very important element of the economic relationship. I think the second most important element is energy. India already, as is a highly import-dependent nation. It imports up to 85% of its crude oil and petroleum requirements. 2/3 of that comes from the Gulf region, including obviously the GCC, Iran, but also Iraq. And finally, as far as trade is concerned, between 2000 and 2018, two-way trade between the GCC as a bloc and India has grown 4 times. It has quadrupled from around $20 billion back in 2000 to about $80 billion in 2018. So India is currently the GCC bloc's 4th largest trading partner. And we've seen billions of dollars worth of investments coming out of the Gulf into the Indian economy, especially from the UAE, sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, including ADNOC, ADIA, A'mar, at some point Etisalat, DP World even, pumping billions into various sectors of the Indian economy, including obviously real estate, refining and petrochemicals, ports, logistics, telecommunications, IT, and so on. With that in mind, we come to the short-term repercussions of the COVID-19 crisis. So the things that are going on as we speak. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has put almost all aspects of Gulf-India relations under strain. The economic picture seems quite bleak. As far as the Indian diaspora is concerned, the lockdown measures in the Gulf have left tens of thousands probably jobless. We've seen up to 300,000 Indians express their interest to be repatriated to India as part of a government repatriation scheme. Obviously, they've been disproportionately affected by the standstill in economic activity in the Gulf. As far as energy is concerned, India's nationwide lockdown has also brought economic activity over there to a standstill. We've seen a massive dip in energy demand. Road and aviation activity is at 25% that of normal levels, of the same levels last year. And according to India's big oil refiners, oil demand is only at about 1/3 of where it normally is. Car sales have dropped down to 50%. So all of these things have a massive impact on global energy demand, which of course reverberates back into fiscal pressures, of course, pressures on the price of oil and thereby on the revenues of the Gulf states. Obviously, this is going to have knock-on effects on trade. These are not entirely visible yet. We don't know them yet, but we know at least that there have been, partly because of the mixed messages, inconsistencies in the application of the lockdown measures in India. We know that there have been supply chain disruptions, even in some vital industries such as agriculture. And we know that there have been massive backlogs in some of India's main and largest ports, even though these might all very well be temporary and might be on their way towards resolution. The political picture, however, is no less bleak. On the Indian side, we've seen quite a bit of pressure on the central government to address the plight of Indian workers in the Gulf and to repatriate them. And so the Chief Minister of Kerala wrote to the Indian Prime Minister asking for that. We've seen Keralite MPs try to petition the Indian Supreme Court to force the government's hand unsuccessfully. And on the Gulf side, we've also seen a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment. We've heard members of parliament in Bahrain describing migrant workers as a ticking time bomb. We've heard calls for mass expulsions and repatriations as well. So the political situation does not seem to be quite favorable. I think on the Gulf side, we're also seeing pressure on governments in the Gulf to address and to take India to task because of the rising Islamophobia and the rising anti-Muslim sentiment over there, with a number of several Gulf celebrities trying to bring attention to those issues. Just to mention that there was a new wave of anti-Muslim sentiment because of a large gathering that had taken place, that was performed by a Muslim religious group, the Tabligh Jamaat, and that had led to a spike in COVID-19 cases, and that unleashed a whole new wave of anti-Muslim rhetoric in India. I think it's fair to say that in what usually happens in crisis situations such as these is that foreign relations can become a highly salient domestic political issue. And when that happens, usually decision makers, be it in democratic or non-democratic countries, would usually prioritize the domestic political dimension and would often bow down to domestic political pressure. I think we're seeing that. We're seeing that in India, although the government had initially refused India's healthcare system to repatriate. India's healthcare system is quite anemic, it's underfunded, understaffed, and so on. Not all Indian states are ready to receive migrants. Kerala seems to be doing a good job, but other states such as Bihar, Rajasthan, for example, might not be as prepared. But even then, the Indian government has bowed down to pressure. It started a few days ago repatriating a first batch of its citizens, about up to 15,000 Indian nationals from 12 states, including the 6 GCC countries. So domestic pressure is working in India to some extent. And it's also working in the Gulf states. So we've seen the Gulf states also try to apply pressure on source countries such as India, Bangladesh, Philippines, and others to take back some of their nationals. And we've seen a leaked cabinet memo from Kuwait, which expressed concern over the treatment of Indian Muslims and even proposed taking India to task at the OIC. So obviously that's a matter of concern. And it's an indicator that even in the Gulf countries, domestic political pressure at times of crisis, when these issues become politically salient, they could constrain the ability of leaders to make progress on certain foreign policy areas. I think the two sides are trying to use diplomatic instruments to smooth some of these things over, but I think that's only going to take them so far. I think domestic political pressure will be the name of the game. Finally, in terms of long-term trajectory, as we come out of the COVID-19 crisis, Gulf-India relations are not usually very hot-button issues. They don't tend to be very salient. And I think when that happens, it is going to be the perception of the policy-making elites on both sides of the aisle that are going to determine the future trajectory of these relations. But in the post-COVID world, I think we're going to see the elite privileging, prioritizing a different set of factors. I'm going to mention 4. I think, first of all, the elites are likely to pay attention to India's economic recovery. Last year, India didn't do very well. It registered growth at around 4.2%, which is nowhere near what it needs, even in order to be able to absorb new entrants into the labor market. The IMF projects sort of post-COVID-19 a rebound in economic recovery of about 7.4% for India in the next fiscal year. That may be the case. We're going to see how well India is able to reform its financial sector, capitalize, fully realize its potential as a manufacturing hub, and so on. But so far, the stimulus package that has been announced by the Indian government is quite pitifully small, at around $20 billion, which is nothing compared to what larger large comparable economies have been doing as well. India's economic recovery is going to be vital for the Gulf, because if India grows at a large rate, that's going to translate into increased demand for energy, which in turn is going to support prices and will suck out some of the fiscal pressures that are pressing on the Gulf at the moment. I think the second key factor that's going to be important for the future trajectory of Gulf-India relations is how centrally India positions itself in newly securitized public health industries. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing of PPE, and so on are probably going to become securitized. They're going to be seen as critical to the national securities of a lot of, I think it's going to be a global trend. the question is, how well can India position itself as a knowledge partner for the GCC states in these areas? How well will it be able to export its knowledge, its know-how in the areas of pharmaceuticals, for example? To what will we see, just as we saw energy security partnerships, food security partnerships, will we see health security partnerships emerging between India and the Gulf? So I think that's a second factor. The third is the extent to which the Gulf states carry out structural immigration and labor market reform. Will we see a political appetite to indigenize, nationalize Gulf labor markets in the post-COVID-19 world, or will we not? And I think obviously that will have major repercussions on Indian migration to the Gulf, on the size of the Indian diaspora, and of course on remittances and so on and so forth. Finally, I think Islam. Will Islam, the treatment of Indian Muslims, transnational religious solidarity, will that become once again a semi-permanent feature of Gulf-India relations? The BJP is going to be in office at least until 2024, which is the period of the next elections. But even secular parties such as the Indian National Congress could run on a Hindu nationalist, so to speak, even though maybe slightly softer platform. We've seen a seismic shift in the Indian electoral landscape, a structural shift to the right. Would it be the first time that the INC, that the Congress party had run on a religious platform? They had done so in 1989. I think at the time, Rajiv Gandhi had even launched his electoral campaign out of the disputed Mandir Masjid site in Ayodhya. So the Indian National Congress is no stranger to religious electioneering and so on. So if this becomes a semi-permanent feature of Indian domestic politics, this might once again complicate relations with the Gulf. I think in a nutshell, the basic point is that although in the short term, India-Gulf relations might be bogged down by domestic political pressures emanating from xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant sentiment and so on. These might place constraints on Indian and Gulf leaders to take relations forward. The long-term trajectory in the post-COVID world, I think it will depend on elite perceptions, which are going to take into consideration a host of new factors that have become, or that will be much more relevant following once we're out of this pandemic. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Hassan. Again, request the public relations team to try and give me access to share the screen. In the meantime, thank you, Hassan. I think you made some very interesting points, and I learned a lot from your perspectives on how things are going to shape up in the months and years ahead. But I think one point that you made is resonating with me is that Gulf-India relations have rarely ever been under any sort of pressure in the past. And I don't know if that'll happen in the future. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why it has not been very dynamic. I think it's been a very comfortable relationship. We have generally thrived on this being just oil, trade, and expatriates. And as a result of which, there has been no pressure on trying to change that comfort levels in terms of the relationship. Will that happen in the future, or is it fine to go ahead on the same track, is what we must wait and watch. Okay, again, just to share a little bit of the screen that I have on India specifically now. This is the artist version of what social distancing is, where the driver sits way away from the passengers in a bus. And a little bit of data in terms of what who India's top trade partners are. As you would see, UAE and Saudi Arabia are in the top 5. And it's also interesting to look at the second data table on the right, just to show you the leap in terms of India GCC trade over the last 20 years. Fine. Let's move on now. And before we move on to Dr. Sharifa, please get ready to pose questions. May I just add that, Hassan, you're already being bombarded with quite a few questions. So please be prepared. Mohammed, you too. And for those of you who are wondering how to go about this, there is the chat sign right at the bottom of your screen. Please type in your questions there, and we'll get back to you in the next 15 minutes. Now to Dr. Sharifa, who caught my eye first when I saw one of her publications titled Look Middle, Look East. I mean, wonderful play of words using Middle East. She's trying to look at middle powers in the east of Asia, and that's why she has a title called Look Middle, Look East, and I thought that was a wonderful play of words. Dr. Sharifa Ladwani is an assistant professor of political science and director, Center for Gulf Studies, American University of Kuwait. She received her PhD from the University of California, Davis. As part of her BA program at the University of Virginia, she double majored in foreign affairs and Asian and Middle Eastern studies. Her current research projects involve the investigation of GCC's socio-political phenomena and changes, and using cross-sectional time series data to analyze the domestic factors for international cooperation. And Dr. Sharifa, it'll be really interesting to see at some point, either now or sometime in the future, how you quantify this sort of a shift. But over to you for now.
Okay, thank you so much. I would also like to ask the PR to allow me to share my screen, if possible. Thank you, because I do have a slide set for you all. Okay. So first, I'd like to extend my greetings and thanks to our hosts this evening at the Emirates Diplomatic Academy and the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. I appreciate and am grateful for the coordinating activities of Dr. Janathan and members of the EDA and King Faisal Center, and I'm delighted to be in the company of my co-panelists, Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Hassan. So I was given 3 questions to address for Japan and Korea, and you've seen these questions before, so I don't think I have to go through them again. But I'm going to start with the first one. I'm very linear in that sense as a quantitative political scientist. Let me give you some general background on Japan. So in February, decision makers and the media watched the rapid onboard spread of coronavirus on the Diamond Princess, a cruise liner docked in Japan. The Wuhan type virus had entered Japan in January and began spreading throughout the prefectures in February and March in a first wave. Japan experienced a second wave of infections in March and April with the European type COVID-19. Only as recently as this week has Japan begun to consider lifting the state of emergency in certain areas. South Korea also recorded its first case in January, but what spurred the Korean government into action was an infection hotspot at the Shincheonji Church, which by the 2nd of March accounted for 62.8% of all cases in South Korea. The government quickly implemented a series of measures involving mass testing, contact tracing, and digital surveillance technology. Some recovered patients have been testing positive again, but they're not relapsing, indicating the sensitivity of tests. South Korea is returning to normalcy as people go back to work, but night spots have remained closed for now. If we kind of go through policy by policy, looking at Japan, which I say is slow and stabilizing, versus South Korea, kind of the model for track, trace, and isolate, we can go kind of through their domestic policies. So there are similarities and differences between Japan and South Korea. Both had their first confirmed cases, which were visitors from China in January. Japan slowly expanded from a city level to a national level emergency in April, while South Korea implemented emergency measures at just a city level, but 2 months prior. Neither had a complete national lockdown, but Japan encouraged partial weekend lockdowns in the city of Tokyo. Both left their airports open, restricting entry into their own countries from China and from each other. But Japan's list of restricted entry is much longer, with dozens of countries on the list, including Kuwait and the UAE, by the 29th of April. While both countries left public transportation open and most workplaces continued to function, schools were shut down, with only South Korea, in large part, moving to online courses. In the health sector, Japan experienced difficulties obtaining PPE last month in Osaka. South Korea is a supplier of personal protective equipment and has plenty of PPE for its own use, but is having trouble obtaining the raw materials to produce enough PPE for export. The governments have also tried to alleviate the financial burden on its denizens with one-time payments and delayed income tax filing. For Japan, their per-person payment doesn't bode well for their already deep national debts. And South Korea's per-household payment excludes the richest 30%, saving the government some money. Overall, with Korea's return to normalcy last month, after the new cases were in the single digits, and with Japan only now, actually tomorrow, only now planning to talk about a return to normalcy, it's been suggested by the media and the World Health Organization that South Korea is one of the more successful countries in dealing with COVID-19. So let's look under the hood. Why? How do we evaluate these responses? Well, first I'll start with Japan. And I call this kind of bread and games or bread and circuses for some of you all that know the Latin term. For Japan, the delayed response to the pandemic was because they didn't want to jeopardize the summer 2020 Olympics. The Olympics would have brought in many tourists and would have been a political legacy for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his Liberal Democratic Party. It was only after the 24th March decision by the Olympic International Committee to delay those Olympics that then the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had taken stronger domestic measures against the spread of coronavirus. For Korea, though, they are more along the lines of a lesson learned is a lesson earned. Collective memory, as Dr. Suderi would say. For the Republic of Korea, the 2-month-long 2015 Middle East Respiratory Syndrome outbreak that infected 186 people and required the quarantine of over 16,000 South Koreans led to the establishment of political and legal measures and institutional mechanisms to deal with epidemics and pandemics. These included greater government transparency, enhanced surveillance ability, quarantine processes, and new hospital measures to reduce in-hospital infections. So that's kind of the beginnings of the evaluations there. But I like to also ask, well, when we're evaluating these kinds of things, what kind of metrics should we use? So I'm coming in from an IR, International Relations quantitative perspective. And so we can look at a lot of these different kinds of metrics. For those that work in health policy, one of the measurements is looking at hospital beds per 10,000 people. And so the metrics here, I've included the US and the UK kind of for a third fun, maybe not so fun, comparative dimension. And I've created a line to see what the WHO recommendation is, 50 beds we should at least have. So we're not always meeting it, but is this an appropriate measure? No, I know a lot of health policy people do this, but the underlying assumption is that an open bed means that the bed is actually viable for pandemic patients, and not all beds are. Beds made for pandemics must be housed in separate wings or separate buildings with separate air circulation and separate staff, along with specialized equipment. Not only that, this WHO data is outdated and populations and hospitals have increased since the data was published. And so for us, this data is not useful aside from offering a very general idea of preparedness. Another common measure might be the number of deaths per 1 million when evaluating responses. So here are the results that I've been able to chart out when it comes to the number of deaths per million. So deaths per million provides a normalized measure, but this measure is actually only useful in our field post-pandemic because then we'll actually get the finalized data. I know it's a little bit morbid, but that's when we'll get the data. So what about testing per million, right? Countries that test are doing a little bit better. Well, again, it seems helpful to track progress, but there are a couple of issues. First, there are tons of different kinds of tests. Secondly, the data that's out there is not always consistent regarding availability for all countries, and countries measure them differently. All right, well, what about the number of new cases per day, right? If you have a decrease in those numbers, then it's very possible that, you're doing well. Okay, Well, here are kind of the number of new cases per day. This is numeric, it's not been normalized for the various countries. What I'd like for you to look at is kind of the curves of Japan and South Korea. Japan doing okay, South Korea totally flattened the curve, doing quite well. But if we look at the other countries, we see that there is somewhat of an upward trajectory. But there's a problem when you're looking at this data as well. It's biased. Both South Korea and the UAE introduced nationwide mass testing. And let's be honest, if you test more, you find more. So this measure might only be useful when you're looking at countries that have introduced nationwide testing. A lot of the people might look at the UK and the US thinking that they have flattened the curve, but I would suggest that the metrics may more likely point up in the next few weeks. The US recently has seen 100%, or I'm sorry, 1,000% increase in cases in Tennessee and Kansas just this week. So I think that that trajectory, what we're seeing is it looks like it's going down, it's probably going up. Okay, and another unfair measure, if you will. There are political measures though, right? Maybe we can look at leader approval rating. And certainly that is the case when we look at Japan. Their leader has had a decreased approval rating, Shinzo Abe. People are not happy with him. But if we look at Moon Jae-in, he's had a big increase in his approval rating. A lot of people in South Korea very much appreciate what he's doing. Another popular measure, as was mentioned before, is the unemployment rate. And so I'm going to post the unemployment rates for Japan and South Korea, make it a little bit less messy. Okay. And interestingly, and in absolute terms, look at the beginning at March 19, 1 year ago, and today, both South Korea and Japan have the same rate of unemployment they had 1 year ago. This may indicate stabilization, but I've got to caution you again. If you just look at the months of the pandemic, you can see that Japan's rate has been steadily rising, whereas South Korea's rate has vacillated. So moving forward to the next question, here I've just kind of evaluated them as various countries, but for us in the GCC, we might evaluate their responses by examining the policies that impact us. So I'm addressing the second question here. Well, I think the short answer is that our relations are stable and strong. I'm going to look at our relations from 3 different angles: the oil trade, our ongoing partnership agreements, and the health sector. So first, let's look at the oil trade. Okay, South Korea, their MOTIE, their Ministry of Trade and Industry, has not posted up-to-date country-level import data when it comes to crude oil. But what I can tell you is that the global March 2020 crude oil imports to South Korea decreased by 13.9% compared to last year. And one of South Korea's top importers of crude oil, Saudi Arabia, has experienced a decrease in overall trade by about 19% since January. Japan, however, their Ministry of Industry has totally posted up-to-date numbers, and so we can get a lot of data from this. Here I've added up all of the crude oil imports from our GCC countries going into Japan, and you all can see that there is definitely a downward trend in Japan's imports of crude oil during the months of the virus. Let's break this up a little bit though. So here what you're looking at, separated by country, is that almost all of us in the GCC contributed to this downward trend, except for the UAE, which has a slight upward tick. And now, right this second, the UAE is currently Japan's largest crude oil supplier. This is kind of, I'm moving ahead a little bit here, but for many of us here in the GCC, Japan and Korea are some of our top trading partners, specifically some of our best oil consumers. Both South Korea and Japan import over 80% of their crude oil from us. When they stop buying, we feel it. But I'm hopeful that as they return to normal domestically and their people go back to work now, that our oil export rates with these 2 countries will normalize. But taking in the Saudi-Russia oil war into consideration, we need to be careful because trade rates might normalize with Japan and South Korea, but that doesn't mean that oil prices will normalize. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is my second point, sorry, the agreement delay. Our GCC countries are highly intertwined with South Korea and Japan with regards to partnerships, be they economic, security, technology, information, health, or infrastructure related. A lot of the contracts and agreements made with Japan and South Korea to further the GCC Vision 20XX plans might be delayed. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of these various agreements, both at, kind of the construction level and partnership level. Recall that Saudi Arabia has an $8.3 billion economic cooperation pact with South Korea. Even total is over 40 billion. Saudi Arabia's second biggest source of foreign capital is Japan. The Emirates has a special strategic relationship with South Korea and a comprehensive strategic partnership initiative with Japan. For Kuwait, there are 17 Korean companies carrying out projects worth 30 billion for us here, and Kuwait has a comprehensive partnership with Japan. Again, a lot of these agreements will be carried out, but not as soon as we imagined. This is on us, though. If Japan and South Korea are getting back to work, they're going to be ready before we are. We may need to create certain exceptions in our infrastructure to allow these deals to move ahead, like open up our airports, if we want to align with some sort of schedule. Finally, I'm going to talk about the health sector a little bit, health relations. So South Korea is putting forward this thing that I'm calling test kit diplomacy. South Korea is a supplier of much needed equipment during this coronavirus. And what's happening is that they're a huge supplier for test kits. 5 major South Korean companies are creating hundreds of thousands of test kits a week to send to over 120 countries around the world. South Korea has even sent the UAE over 51,000 test kits. The UAE is a priority to South Korea. South Korea has also sent over test kits to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait in large numbers. But, please don't ignore Japan either. At the very least, Japan taught us how quickly the virus spread with the Diamond Princess incident, and this taught us to take rapid and strong measures within our own countries. Finally, I'm going to address the last question very quickly. In short, I have a more positive outlook than my colleagues. I think we're going to have an expansion of ties with the agreement continuation. We've already discussed that. I think they're going to continue. I think that they might be delayed. And if we in the GCC are getting our deliverables in a timely and in a high quality manner, we may even expand those. Our oil trade will normalize. The rate of trade will normalize, not necessarily the price. And as both South Korea and Japan get involved a lot more with trade and agreements, they might try to ensure that this area is more secure security-wise. But they might be reluctant to conclude these, to overtly conclude security arrangements. That being said, they might be even more reluctant if China takes the lead on security arrangements. So they might continue some very quiet security arrangements, bilateral agreements with some of the GCC countries, which they've been doing in the past. As a Kuwaiti, I hope for multilateralism, but I think they're probably going to be bilateral. And I'll end with a really fun, weird idea. I think we actually have an opportunity to go into plastics. So, epidemics and pandemics have this huge demand and a large demand for plastics. And you all know that tons of PPE, personal protective equipment for hospitals, is from plastics. And we require a lot more plastic utensils and containers during times of pandemic. There are going to be a lot more pandemics in the future. Perhaps we can conclude an agreement with Japan and South Korea that allows us to obtain kind of their medical expertise and supply expertise in order to perhaps convert some of our oil dependency into a secondary industry of the plastics. So thank you all, and I'll look forward to your questions and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Sharifa. Again, I request Pia to allow me to share screen, please. And yeah, as I do that, I just want to tell you, Sharifa, that no one's forgotten Japan and South Korea, really. In fact, I think the whole process of the Gulf beginning to associate modernization with Asia was because of Japan and South Korea, largely. I think the Gulf had got very comfortable with associating modernization with westernization. The whole process of Easternization gaining resonance in terms of modernization was through what happened with Japan and South Korea, really. So yeah, useful points. And I want you to start thinking in terms of how the Gulf's relations with Japan and South Korea will impact the fourth industrial revolution. I think that's the next big thing, and how will it impact their ties? You'll have questions. I have a whole lot of comments and questions coming in. We will now I just want to close this session of presentations with final slides. Sorry, here it is. Yeah, I think this is why I said the fourth industrial revolution is very crucial. This is what is going to happen in terms of the future. We are already seeing this in Japan and South Korea. I haven't seen such pictures emerge out of anywhere else, but this is what is happening. And I found this picture fascinating. Imagine this is what South Korea is doing in terms of a graduation ceremony. It seems they're using robots with iPads hung on them, with pictures of the students, and they're marching along collecting their degrees. I think this is fascinating. And this is a slide that shows Japan's contribution to GCC trade. It has its ups and downs, perhaps largely in terms of what the oil prices are. And I think this perhaps also tries to suggest South Korea's ups and downs in terms of oil trade, depending on what the price of oil is. This encapsulates what all the three speakers have suggested in terms of the Asian countries being the biggest buyers of crude. And you would see there at the bottom a little footnote which says that Asia's big four buy almost 2/3 of Gulf crude exports. Hassan talked about remittances, and there are plenty of questions, Hassan, for you on the labor issues. I'll come to that in a bit. And this perhaps encapsulates what has happened with Gulf Asia trade. Look at the figures on the extreme left in terms of 1990 and 2000. 1990, of course, the European Union and United States certainly outbeat the Asian countries, but in 2000, they were on par. And look at where they stand in 2018. Just trade with China and India surpasses the trade with European Union and United States combined. So I think that kind of tells you a story of what's happening around there. And when we talk in terms of the future, this is a picture that the International Energy Organization puts up for us in terms of what the energy demand could be from Asia. And so I think there is still hope in terms of Gulf-Asia relations progressing along a positive note. So this completes the presentations by our expert speakers. Let me add, for me, this is the first time in 20 years of studying Gulf-Asia relations that I have been part of an entire panel comprising scholars who are Gulf nationals, which underlines the importance of this dynamic. And what we heard today is a Gulf perspective on domestic issues of Asia and Gulf-Asia relations. Now, for the question and answer session, I'd just like to remind everyone to keep them short and smart. Let me start with the first one. This is from Erica Brewers, and she asks a question to Hassan. If you could talk a little more in terms of how the labor relations and the labor migration pattern will take shape in the years ahead. And Hassan, there are a couple of more questions. Maybe you can kind of answer them in one go. In terms of the economic fallout for foreign workers, in nearly all the GCC states. Do you see the Indian government being prepared to absorb those returning, or will you see them coming back once the crisis somewhat abates? Do you see an alternative for Indian migrants to the Gulf? That's question 2 from Carla Isa. And I think there are a couple of more questions. You want to answer those before we move on to the next ones?
Sure. Thank you, Narinap. I took a look at some of these questions beforehand, and we'll try to answer, sort of cluster the relevant ones together. So in response to Erica, how do sort of patterns of labor migration from India to the Gulf? I think there's a good article online that's quite up to date by Dr. John Calabrese that discusses recent patterns in Indian migration to the Gulf. It's on the Middle East Institute website. Basically, I think there are 2 or 3 main takeaways from that. We've seen a general decline in the number of e-migration permits that have been granted on the Indian side. So that's a proxy for the number of immigrants that come out of India to the Gulf. We've seen a decline since 2014. And I think that gradual decline can probably be explained by the rising cost of living in the Gulf states, subsidy reforms that have obviously contributed to that, indigenization or nationalization policies of the labor market, and of course, growth in India, which contributes to decreasing the wage gap and obviously blunts the incentive for Indians to migrate to the Gulf. So that's one, I think, important pattern. The second important pattern is the changing composition of Indian migration. So we're no longer seeing as many blue-collar workers coming out of Kerala. Kerala is no longer a key contributor of flows in recent years, although obviously the stock of migration from Kerala in the Gulf states, the numbers of people that are already there is very important. But we've seen a greater flow, outpour of people from other poorer states, such as Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, coming out, Tamil Nadu also, but even though it's not very poor, coming out into the Gulf. So we can see a shift in the composition in terms of where the Indian migrants are coming from. So these are the patterns in the past few years. How does it take shape going forward? Well, that depends. I think this also touches on one of the questions that Carla has asked, Carla Isa. How do Gulf nations replace migrant workers? So in a sense, what we generally have in the Gulf, and labor economists will tell you this much better than I do, we seem to have a dual labor market phenomenon, right? So you have one labor market that's composed of Gulf nationals. That's very rigid. Most of them tend to be employed by the government. It's very hard to let them go. And because it's very hard to let them go, usually it's also hard to hire them. And so the numbers tend to increase very, very gradually over a long period of time. Then you have a parallel labor market, the one that's sort of composed of the migrants coming out of India, Bangladesh, and many other places. This is an extremely flexible labor market, right? So when there's an uptick in economic activity, the number of hirings that take place in that labor market amongst expatriates tend to be huge. So if you look at the number of the extent of employment amongst non-nationals in the Gulf, it usually climbs at a much faster rate because it's easier to let them go. So obviously the flip side is when we see a downturn in economic activity, as we are seeing at the moment because of the COVID-19 pandemic and are likely to see for the rest of this year, because it's a very flexible labor market, they're also the first ones that businesses and enterprises and so on let go of. But the thing is, again, post-COVID-19, it depends. So if absent any structural reforms in Gulf immigration policies, in Gulf labor market policies, it's very likely that once we open the doors again, most of these jobs, most of these immigrants will return. Economic growth in India hasn't been that fantastic, which means that we are likely to see a very large number of people that are unemployed. This means that the wage gap will remain in place, even though we will see a rising cost of living in the Gulf because of subsidy reforms, because of increases in VAT and austerity and so on. But the wage gap will be there because wages will probably be depressed in India if economic growth does not pick up. And so migration will continue. If, on the other hand, the Gulf states do implement structural reforms to their labor markets, then I think all bets are off. We're going to be in not fully uncharted territories because we have seen some reforms in the past. But if these reforms are much more radical, if they make a much bigger dent in the patterns, then who knows? I think what could end up happening is that from an economic perspective, obviously the labor supply in the Gulf states will decrease, which means that the cost of labor will increase, which means most likely that businesses that aren't able to transition to a labor efficient, capital intensive business model will likely suffer and perhaps even disappear. There was also one related question, which was how will sort of the Indian side view this if there were structural reforms, if migration were to come down, if remittances were to disappear, would India perceive this as a national security threat? I think this was the question posed by Rasha Al-Jundi. I would say, obviously, the question of the Indian diaspora, even the welfare, the well-being of the Indian diaspora can become a security issue. It was obviously a security issue to a large extent. It mandated a security response during the 1991 Gulf War, but that was a conflict situation. So that's slightly different. I don't think that it will necessarily be perceived as a national security issue. I think if this has an sort of an endogenous, if this is endogenous to the economic logic of the GCC states, then I think that's something different. And I think it will be confined to the economic realm. Let's not forget that the returns on migration, so to speak, and thereby the impact of a decrease in migration, the impact of a decrease in remittances, are not uniformly distributed across India. India is a federal system. It has different states. Obviously, certain states like Kerala might be disproportionately affected, but India as a whole, however, might not feel the pain in much the same way. Will Kerala be able to exert itself on the central government to bring about a response, a foreign policy response? They haven't been very successful in doing that, to be honest, except in limited circumstances and in crisis situations. So we'll see, I guess is the short answer.
Yeah, thank you, Hassan. I think you answered those three plus a question from Yasmin, which is also about the migration pattern and the reduced remittances, etc. I think we'll pose some questions to Mohammed Al-Sudairi now. One, Mohammed, is from your namesake, Mohammed Al-Dahnani from the Emirates Diplomatic Academy. And he asks, how might the Saudi G20 presidency further support international efforts to counter social impact of COVID-19 pandemic? And I think a more pertinent question would be, I think quite a few people have posed this question, Mohammed Al-Hajri, and I'll name a few more, but all of them relate to the impact of COVID-19 on Belt and Road initiative in the Gulf countries.
Well, thank you so much for the questions and the engagement. This really excites us, as it were. It shows that there's interest. I'll try to answer these various questions, beginning with sort of Saudi's role in the G20. This is really beyond my area of expertise, but as far as I know, the Saudi government, due to its presidency of the G20, has hosted a number of key meetings related to coordinating a global response, including the G20 countries, the World Bank Group, the IMF, the United Nations, to try and coordinate medical assistance, to provide platforms for research cooperation, and essentially upping up greater dialogue across governments to contain the spread of the pandemic. So that's really as simple as it is, I would suppose, my answer, that is. I apologize, I can't offer a more detailed response. But I can, however, offer a more detailed response for the other questions that have been posed with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as Hamid Al-Mansour's question on Deng Xiaoping's reforms. With regards to the Belt and Road Initiative, and what's COVID-19's impact. I think it's interesting that people bring this up because a few days ago, the Emirati ambassador to China, Ali al-Zahiri, had actually given an interview discussing this issue to Caixin, which is a very prominent economic magazine in China. And he actually warned about the politicization of delays in the implementation of Belt and Road Initiative projects. So I think there is a general expectation that because of the economic disruptions that have taken place globally, there is going to be a delay both in terms of the actual construction and realization of these projects on the ground, due to the fact that there are labor disruptions, that there are lockdowns imposed, and also the fact that the money itself will not materialize in various contexts. This is not as relevant to the Gulf. And I should mention also that generally speaking, this is an interesting note to take into consideration. If we look at the average FDA outflow from China globally, it has averaged around 90 to 120 billion US dollars. The vast majority of this outflow has often gone to OECD countries. BRI countries, in fact, are countries that are part of the developing zone of countries associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, have really gotten a very small slice of this pie, something in the realm of 12 to 13 billion US dollars. And that's after considerable political momentum from the Chinese state to encourage companies to invest and whatnot. So this is a dynamic to take into consideration, that you already had very low investments to begin with prior to COVID-19, and this will become less. Now, of course, this is less relevant to the Gulf and more relevant in other contexts, but this is something to take into consideration. Another aspect that's quite interesting is how COVID-19 is actually increasing the utility of certain infrastructural networks that had been created under the rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are some preliminary studies, for example, that are looking at the increase in the use of railway systems that had been built in Central Asia as alternatives because of the shutdown in air travel. Now, whether these trends are going to continue post-COVID-19 is anyone's guess, but it's interesting how the pandemic has created unanticipated consequences in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think a last point, though, that should be taken into account, that a lot of the projects in the Gulf specifically that are associated with the Belt and Road Initiative are oftentimes local government-led projects, infrastructurally or development zones, like say Silk City in Kuwait, which we had just recently issued a report about, on other economic development zones. And some of these probably, because of the strain on Gulf revenues and because of the structural reforms taking place, there will probably be a suspension in the development of these projects. So again, the disruptions will probably cause delay, but looking forward, the Belt and Road Initiative is going to stay with us. I mean, at the end, the Communist Party of China had inserted the Belt and Road Initiative into the party constitution back in 2017 during the 19th Party Congress. So this is a definitive political project that will stay so long as President Xi is in office, and probably even for his successors, but who knows. So I hope this sort of answers some of the questions that have been raised with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. The last question about whether the Gulf states can apply Deng Xiaoping's reforms, I think the context domestically and internationally that China faced is vastly different from what Gulf policymakers face today. I mean, you were talking about a country that had started off from very low living standards, had largely underutilized labor force, was facing an international market that was very open to investing considerably into China. And I should also mention that one of the key differences is that the Chinese reform process throughout the 1980s was not clear-cut and not centralized. In fact, if you look at internal debates at the level of the Chinese leadership, there was considerable disagreement about what was the future course forward. For instance, some party leaders such as Chen Yun thought that they should return back to a model of the 1950s, where you had relative opening, but still continued control by the state on the market dynamics. Others wanted to retain the Maoist economic model and just reform certain features of it. So this notion that the Chinese leadership under Deng Xiaoping pursued a very clear-cut vision of reform and opening does not actually accord with reality. So it's really on two levels, the situation is very different. The political economic challenges that the Gulf is facing hand in hand with the international context is very, very different, right? And the other aspect of it is that one of the key differences is that the Chinese leadership only had perhaps consensus that what had taken place in the 1960s and 1970s under Mao was no longer workable. And what was the path forward was unclear, right? But this is quite different in the case of the Gulf, where I think there is vast recognition on the part of Gulf leaders that the current status quo is unsustainable and that there is need for structural change. Now, of course, the specifics and details of the structural change is still open to considerable debate, very much as is the case anywhere, but the challenges and the context is very different. But it's an interesting comparison. So I thank you for that question.
Thank you, Mohammed. Sharifa, I will spare you one question from a seafood lover, Amin. It says, when will we resume seafood trade between the Gulf and East Asia? I don't think you need to really answer that unless you have an answer. But I think one question that is being posed is in terms of, I think it tries and compares what Mohammed said. The energy trade will decline, but won't technology trade as such increase? I think the engagement between the two sides in terms of technology, given that the fourth industrial revolution is all about technology, how do you think that will pan out?
So I would say that within the GCC, there are different levels of how ready we are for that. I think I would definitely give a big nod to the UAE in that I think that they're the most ready. I can say for Kuwait, we might not always be ready for certain moves forward, particularly when it comes to cybersecurity. We've experienced some breaches in cybersecurity in Kuwait along with other Gulf countries, and it would be wonderful if we would be able to build the human capital to be able to address that and to build this industry, this fourth industrial sector. But again, I think we have a lot of variation amongst the GCC. And when I say variation, I mean, you know, our governments and are full of older people in general. And older people, sometimes it's hard to convince them how truly important this is or that this can be until we get a hack. And then we're like, hey, you know, we told you this computer stuff's kind of important. I know in my own experience, I have friends that are white hat hackers. So what that means is that they hack a company to show the company that there's a possible weakness in the system. And that's something that's not always appreciated by all industries in our area. And so I think there's a lot of learning that needs to happen. We need to push some money into that sector to give scholarships to our students who would like to pursue this field. And we can build it from now, but we've got to really start soon.
Thank you, Sharifa. There are two questions, and I think we can combine it, and I would like Hassan and Mohammed to answer them in terms of how will the Gulf's relations with India and Pakistan and China. There is a sense of competition that's going on between India and China, and what it will be in the future in terms of the Gulf, and how will China play this role in terms of India-Pakistan relations. I think that's an important one to address. And perhaps in one way or the other, you can link the religious dynamic to it. And both of you can also quickly answer in terms of, we have seen the treatment of Muslims in China, and that didn't change anything regarding pressure from the Gulf countries. I think even with India, we will not see any pressure. More thoughts on that, and quick ones, please. We may have time for one last question thereafter.
All right, so I'll jump right in, and I'll start with the latter question, the question posed by Hamad al-Mansouri. His premise is very simple. I mean, we didn't see I think, if I understand this question correctly, we didn't see a very strident or a very strong Gulf reaction on the treatment of Muslims in China. Why should we see it in the Indian context? I think it's, on some level, there already is some pressure by the Gulf states on India as far as the treatment of Muslims, as far as Kashmir is concerned, right? And we see that taking place on the multilateral level through the Gulf states' involvement and leadership of the OIC. So obviously Saudi Arabia, for example, is part of the core OIC, OIC being Organization of Islamic Cooperation, core focus group on Kashmir. Saudi Arabia is a very important player in that group. And historically speaking, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia especially have been vocal critics of India on this front, at least as far as the OIC is concerned. Now, the difference is that on the bilateral side, yes, this is no longer an issue on the bilateral agenda. But I think in recent months, and I wrote an article for this on this with the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, we've seen, for example, even the Saudi foreign minister who visited Pakistan, I think in December, if I'm not mistaken, promising perhaps to hold a special OIC session on the issue of Kashmir. Although there was a big debate as to whether it would take place in Islamabad or Jeddah and so on. So in a sense, that's a gesture the like of which we hadn't seen from Saudi Arabia in quite some time. Saudi Arabia obviously will face pressure. It's part of a contest for the leadership of the Islamic world, right? It has to compete with Turkey, it has to compete with Malaysia and Iran, all of which will try to claim that mantle away from Saudi Arabia, all of which will engage in a certain degree of one-upmanship, so to speak, as far as global Muslim causes are concerned. Kashmir is a very important one. We've seen the Iranians trying to cultivate influence over there. Turkey and Malaysia came out very strongly in support of Pakistan on the sidelines of the UN and have taken part in a Malaysian summit where Kashmir was obviously on the agenda, right? So this is going to place pressure on countries like Saudi Arabia, even Kuwait, perhaps to a degree, to play a more important role, perhaps in the future when it comes to Indian Muslims. Again, it depends. It depends on whether there is domestic political pressure in these different Gulf countries. Let's not forget that different Gulf countries are sensitive to varying degrees on as far as the domestic political pressure is concerned. Kuwait obviously tops the list, has a very strong civil society, a very vocal parliament, and so from time and time again, the government will find itself having to respond, display sensitivity to this domestic political pressure, and perhaps take India to task. Finally, a very short word before I pass it on to Mohammed on great power competition. I think both China and India, as far as the Gulf states are concerned, have been confined to the geo-economic realm. Right? These are geo-economic actors. Even though India might, dispatch the Indian Navy, for example, following the Iranian attacks on Aramco, following the Iranian attacks on shipping in the Gulf, dispatch the Indian Navy to escort Indian ships and tankers and so on. But still, India is not a geopolitical actor in the Gulf. Neither is China. If anything, Pakistan is much more of a geopolitical actor than either of these two states. Right? Pakistani troops have actually seen military action. They've been part of the security architecture of the Gulf states, and so on. So I think we're still speaking within the geo-economic realm as far as these two states are concerned. Will that change with the retreat, the gradual erosion of the U.S. security umbrella? I think that's a question that we could save for another webinar.
Well, I'll try to address the questions that have been raised from my angle or vantage point. They largely supplement Hassan's, I think, commentary. I think one of the differences that we see between Kashmir and, for example, Xinjiang, or the broader treatment of Muslim communities of China, is that there are several key differences. I think one is that Xinjiang in general is peripheralized and largely invisibilized in the imaginaries of international Muslim communities, right? And there's also a very real linguistic barrier in terms of people sympathizing and actually being very aware of what the dynamics that are taking place on the ground there. Another issue, I think, which is really highlights the difference between China and India, is that China has already developed the state capacities to try and reshape discourses about its domestic policies internally. And so since 2009, when the major Urumqi riots had happened, and where you had actually a global Muslim uproar about the killings and the violence that had taken place there, the Chinese authorities had begun to invest significantly in trying to engage with international Muslim organizations, with Muslim governments to reshape the discussion. And we're actually seeing the success of that type of outreach and engagement policy. Like when international criticisms were growing in the end of 2018 about the vocational training camps in Xinjiang, we actually saw repeated engagement with the OIC on the part of Chinese counterparts. And there has been a sustained approach in trying to ensure that no criticisms emerge. And I think this has also been reinforced by the fact that leaders on both sides did not want to wish to politicize the issue. And I think there is also a general agreement on the ways in which leaderships, both in the GCC and in China, think about the role of religion. Right? There's awareness about transnational links, awareness and emphasis on the language of moderation, which the Chinese officials at least repeat when they deal with their GCC counterparts. And I think the last most important point is that unlike India, China has far greater economic wherewithal and has shown a willingness to use economic measures to punish different political actors. We've seen this largely in the context of corporations, Western governments, for example, when it comes to sovereignty issues like Taiwan or Huawei, or in dealing with political activists in China and their treatment. So this is also probably an element that really distinguishes China from India, right? We are dealing with a geopolitical context where we have a risen China that is far more active in using its political and economic weight, while India is still in a process of development and actually sort of growing out. Now, with the last comment on sort of China, South Asia, and sort of its connection with Saudi and the UAE, I think that the key point is that for China, at least my impression in reading and engaging with how Chinese scholars, for example, think about India, is that they don't often think of India as a peer. They think of India in terms of their geopolitical competition with the United States. So their relationship with Pakistan is often seen as a proxy relationship to balance what they perceive as Washington's utilization of India. Now, this is, of course, a reduction, and there's a lot of complexity in the relationship between these various actors. But I think this overall dynamic holds with regards to how China perceives South Asia. There's an excellent book, actually, I recommend attendees consider looking at. It's by Andrew Small, which is the China-Pakistan Axis. And it sort of looks in a very detailed fashion at the strategic relationship between China and Pakistan. It probably provides a lot of insights. And my impression generally is that the various actors, and Hassan can correct me on this, there isn't necessarily a desire to securitize or problematize engagement with the UAE or Saudi Arabia in relation to the existing relationships between these different actors. So we don't see necessarily considerable Indian objections to Saudi Arabia's participation in the BRI project in Pakistan, which the Pakistani and Chinese governments have welcomed. But again, this requires its own webinar.
Sure. Mohammed, I just want to finish off the question answer session with one more question to you, and I hope you can answer this in 30 seconds. Do you expect the US and the other Western allies trying to pressure the Gulf countries to reduce their economic relations with China in an international backlash to COVID-19?
I think that there is a lot of... Yeah, I think there is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of attempts to impose such pressure increasingly, but we have to also be realistic. For instance, during the Obama administration, which was in a much better geopolitical position than the Trump administration, they tried to pressure many countries to not participate in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China had created. In fact, they caused their own trouble by politicizing this issue considerably, and it led to them losing face, with many governments, including Western allies, joining the AIIB. The issue or the problem looking forward is what will happen is that as Gulf countries, for example, deepen their technological ties with China, 5G, adopting technological standards, there will be less of a willingness, for example, to maintain security cooperation on the part of the US with these Gulf allies. And the basis or the excuse that will be used is, well, espionage concerns, compromising of hardware and software. And this is really the issue that will become a growing problem down the line.
Thank you, Mohammed. I just want to give Sharifa 30 seconds if she has any thoughts.
No, I agree with Mohammed's last point in particular about kind of the concerns that we may have and that definitely the US will have when it comes to China's involvement in that fourth industry, in the GCC. It could get real messy. So I totally agree.
Great. Just to let you know that there are quite a few comments from our attendees, and most of them seem to agree with the analyses that you have provided. Hassan, you can speak to Sumita separately. She's got a question for you. And can I share a slide, please, if the PR can allow me to share my last slide? I thought this is a wonderful way of ending this evening's discussion, because there's already innovation in terms of what life would look like post-COVID. And it seems Thailand is already getting ready in terms of welcoming visitors with this sort of face mask by some of their traditional artists. I think that's a positive note on which we can end. Overall, it seems that Asia has thus far fared better in dealing with this crisis. Only time will tell how things pan out in future and how this will impact Gulf-Asia relations. I know we don't have answers to all the problems, but I hope this discussion has helped most of us get a better grip of the problems we are facing and what the future holds for us. These are certainly unprecedented times. No one knows what lies ahead, what policies are right and wrong. I'm sure there'll be lots of trials and errors as we move on. But one thing I'm quite sure is that the need and greed for vitamin M, which is money, will keep the wheels of the economy chugging along. The human spirit of survival, innovation, and entrepreneurship has overcome many setbacks in the past, and we will in the future too. Remember, we have to get used to a life amid COVID-19, which could well be the new normal in the next year or two. This is challenging, but not impossible. Every crisis is also an opportunity. I would like to apologize to one or two attendees, I think, who posed questions. We couldn't, but I'm sure the answers that our panelists gave to other questions somehow touched on your questions as well. I would like to thank Mohammed, Hassan, and Sharifa for sharing their time and expertise. Thank you, audience, most of whom have had a long day. Last but not the least, thanks to a whole lot of people at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies and the Emirates Diplomatic Academy, who have worked behind the scenes to make this event possible. Stay safe and have a good evening. Ma salama.